Welcome back, Bantwana Benkosi. This is Power Talk indeed. We are joined by Professor Patrick Bond online, and Professor Patrick Bond is a professor at University of Johannesburg, and we're also joined by the president of GIWUSA, General Industries Workers Union of South Africa, Mametlwe Sibei. Professor Bond, good morning.
Hey, very good morning to you, Mbuyiseni.
Are you still at UJ? Is that correct information?
Yes, forever. Great place to be.
Okay.
Marxists are thick on the ground, and it's a happy birthday to Karl, our old Uncle Whiskers, age 207 today. So yes, very happy at UJ.
Okay, Sibei, welcome to Power Talk, Ngwanandati.
Hojak, thank you, and greetings also, Patrick and your listeners. Happy to be here.
Prof, I want to start with you. Just the basic 101 introduction, who Karl Marx was, his impact in the world, and why he's a significant figure to think through the problems of political economy in the world.
Well, I think Mametlwe Sibei will also give you a very good sense of the political urgency of the Marxist way of approaching capitalism. For me, as more of a backroom armchair academic, you remember those from Wits, those types, right? We don't really have much influence. What we'd like to be able to do is have a clear sense of the logic of capitalism and of class struggle and of the multiple ways that commodification of life impinges upon our peoples and our environments. And I think Karl Marx, from 1818, his birth, May 5th, 207 years ago, and particularly his early role as a revolutionary, the 1848 uprisings of workers across Europe, was partly the beginning of the sort of communist movement in the First International, partly thanks to Karl Marx and his ally Fred Engels. Engels actually owned a big textile factory in Manchester, both of them Germans, but then was able to finance Marx's work when Marx sat around for another few decades next to the British Museum. He went in there regularly to sit and read and think, and he wrote extraordinary texts. And the one that I think is most powerful, his Bible, the book called Das Kapital, meaning capital. And it's the laws of motion of the system. It's how the commodity is produced, the role of labor, and the ways in which crises begin. And I certainly picked up when I was at a school called Wharton School of Finance, which was in the early 80s. It was between when Donald Trump and Elon Musk also studied at the same place. And I was dissatisfied with the understanding in the early 80s of capitalist crisis tendencies. And I turned to Marxism, especially at Johns Hopkins University, where I did a PhD. So this was in Baltimore and Philadelphia in the US. And we could really feel that the way Marxist crisis theory could be applied got us into work with anti-apartheid and third world solidarity movements, because the banks at the time were displacing that crisis into a debt crisis. And so I think that gave me a sense, wow, this is a real living theory.
And I think both of us would agree he's important, or rather one of, I would think it is the most significant contribution would be the labor theory of value. And I thought you could take our listeners through a basic introduction of what the labor theory of value is on the one hand, and how this theory can help us make sense of the fourth industrial revolution, at the center of which is generative AI, automation, and self-sufficient, self-regulating robots.
Yes, and I think what you're saying, that automation is part and parcel of capitalism. That's what you get immediately out of reading the first volume out of 3 of Das Kapital. That is, when capitalists get into competitive battles with each other, what they tend to do is to replace less productive workers with more productive machines. We're seeing this now amped up really on steroids. And the basic logic between that capitalist and a worker who comes into the factory, sits down at the machine and works, the basic logic is that the capitalist has a lot of social power and can hire and fire the workers at will, and then not pay them the full value of what they produce in a given day. And they would sort of say, well, there's a lot of machinery that's involved that we have to repay our shareholders, our owners who've invested. And so you need to take out some. But even after you take out that rent or the profits that then are reinvested in new machines, you still have a situation where a worker doesn't get the full value. And that's the labor theory. That is, when you have a commodity, part of it is the surpluses that are taken away from the worker. That surplus value, that surplus beyond what is paid to the worker who is applying themselves, along with, obviously, there's nature, there's natural resources, but that worker's labor is the core of the way capital exploits. And the crucial point then, Mbuyiseni, that I think applies more and more as we get into the fourth industrial revolution, as we get AI and robotics replacing workers, is that when you look for that competitive edge and you replace your workers with machines, you can't really cheat in the exchange between capitalists. That is, you can't really go between one supplier, let's say OpenAI, of software that will make your system more productive and get some surplus there. You only really have the ability to get that surplus when you're exploiting a worker. And that's where capitalism has its most profound internal contradiction, that it needs profits to come from the surpluses that workers provide, and yet it's always looking to be more competitive against the opposition, other capitalists. And so therefore it automates, and therefore it undermines the very basis for which it will continue to operate with profits. That's the underlying crisis tendency in capitalism, I think, is most profound, and it leads to extraordinary overproduction, overaccumulation of capital, as we call it.
And what does the fate of this fourth industrial revolution come with? The end of work or also the end of profit?
Well, it could be both, because the work that is being squeezed out, just think of the opposition we're seeing initially from people in the gig work industry who don't want to have the 0-hour system, or the bank tellers who are opposed to full automation of their jobs. Even myself, a university professor, I'll be automated out with all sorts of techniques. Even my students are using ChatGPT to write their essays, and I'm struggling to find a way to say, no, that's cheating, that's plagiarism. All of these threats to our work are also, therefore, not merely capital labor at the point of production, that factory relationship, but they're also in the rest of the society. So when you don't like surveillance, when you're going around the Gauteng highways and you give the finger to the e-tolling, you're also part of opposition. So are you if you oppose financial inclusion techniques that were dreamed up by cash paymaster services in the World Bank, and you fight against that if you're Black Sash and you put CPS into bankruptcy, as they did in 2020, or you don't like bots coming around like Bill Pottinger, and you work along with others in the kind of anti-Zuma movement to get rid of, let's say, that penetration of your mind, of your life by the machines. And those are all parts of a fourth industrial counter-revolution that I find very compelling in South Africa, even getting rid of intellectual property on AIDS medicines, which rose our life expectancy from 52 to 65 in the period 2004 to just before COVID. Extraordinary victory for the Treatment Action Campaign. That was also against intellectual property, a bastion of this fourth industrial revolution. So, I find it's very, very important not just to be, let's say, a Marxist in a trade union working only at the point of production, but all over the society, this supra-commodification, this reduction of life to surveillance and privatization of everything, and our resulting consumer mentality and the kinds of ways big data control us. All of this is what I think a good Marxist is out there fighting.
Well, the investment in the subject of revolution as the worker, specifically the industrial worker, in Marx's work, what is the implication of that at this moment, with the anticipation that this subject could be completely annihilated, as a subject in the circuit of capital?
Yes, that's the big question. Can we get alliances between workers who are being annihilated, that is, automation, which is a tendency in capitalism? Marx talked about, he called it relative surplus value, along with absolute surplus value, that is, you have to work much harder and longer hours. But the relative surplus value is where that replacement of the worker with the machines, now AI increasingly and robotics. And that means that you have a choice of being a Luddite. You can kind of fight the machines, or you can demand that the productivity be socialized. That's what I love about South Africans, is especially with the treatment action campaigns. We're not against new technology, of course not. We need those antiretroviral medicines. We just need them free, provided through the state, not costing 120,000 Rand a year, provided by a private medical aid. And they did that. And that was the, I think, greatest, let's say, anti-capitalist victory we've seen since the end of apartheid. And, it is, Mbuyiseni, so crucial. We have labor movements that have gone from being quite open social trade unionists based in community civics. The old Sanko was full of leaders from trade unions. But since the mid-90s, the professionalization of unions, the investment companies, the ways in which class snuggle instead of class struggle has emerged, for example, through NEDLAC, the National Economic Development and Labor Commission. Those kinds of, let's say, transitions that our workers have suffered mean that they become economistic. So if they're digging coal at Glencore, that coal goes to Israel and fuels the genocide. But even the biggest, the best union in so many ways, the National Union of Metal Workers, hasn't gotten a handle on the fact that its workers are part and parcel of Israel's IDF, Israel Defense Forces, machinery to kill Palestinians. And that's, I think, where we need these workers to find more and more alliances. And I think actually the best of these unions is GAWUSA, General Industrial Workers Union of South Africa. I'm biased, and it's partly because I admire the work of Mbuyiseni, who links his Marxisms into not just the workplace and fighting for justice for workers and fighting against surplus value extraction, but also all the other manifestations of capitalism.
Well, Sibey, with you, what is at the moment the membership base of GAWUSA?
I couldn't get that.
The membership base of GAWUSA.
What you are saying? What is the membership base of GAWUSA?
Mm-hmm, well, at the moment,
GAWUSA, we it has had many lives, right? One is that it came out of the split in the chemical industry workers affiliate of COSATU, that is APAU. So we are actually mostly organized in the pharmaceutical and chemical industries, but also I came through the outsourcing must fall. Particularly against the background of the movement of students in universities in 2015 and so on. But even before that, I had been working with them, and we brought some of the workers from the mining industry in 2012 and the food industry in companies like Clover. So it's widespread, across various industries, but I think I would say the core is the chemical industries, is the food industries, and of course with workers in formally outsourced services in a number of sectors across the economy.
And with what Prof was saying about, we've had a sort of big era beginning in the 1980s if you are in the rest of the world, but that sort of took root here in South Africa in the 1990s, which was the sort of neoliberal era that fundamentally undermined a lot of normal contracts. You had just said at the moment, lots of workers getting outsourced with privatization, with marketization. This has been the struggle, and that has had a big impact on unionization. In your estimation, this opening era of automation, generative AI, what challenges does it present to the unity of the industrial working class?
Well, it does. But I think the core and the essence of the problem really is a political program, particularly of the leadership and the official, organizations of the workers' movement. I think Comrade Patrick eloquently articulated the tendencies, in capitalism and why in the quest to constantly revolutionize means of production to increase productivity, there is always restructuring in the workplace all the time. And what that means is that there has been shifts, in industries one or the other. If you think about industries that were the backbone of the labor movement about 100 years ago, many of them don't exist. Even when I was growing up, the matches factories and so on, when it used to be, relying on candle lights and so on, that would have been, massive industries, even in a country like ours. All of that is gone, right? So there has been, of course, in the recent period, an increased precarity of labor. And when you look into quarterly employment statistics, one after the other, one thing that is very consistent is that workers are losing jobs in generally more secure, permanent forms of employment, replaced by temporary, short-term, and other casualized forms of labor. And that is conscious both on the part of the employers, but I also think that is being complemented by the policies and the law, the regulatory regime on the part of the ANC. I mean, look at the amendments that we're confronting with at the present moment that want to also make it easy to fire workers, to deny workers of the union representation in case of workers that are being terminated during probation, to expand basis of, dismissal. So where there have been, sort of outsourcing and casualizing other industries, what they now want to do is to actually make precarious the entire industrial working class. And that is a problem, and that has significantly weakened the labor movement.
In this case, I mean, maybe just to sort of measure for us this fracture of trade unionism in South Africa. Let's paint it for us properly. Where do the trade unions stand in strength vis-a-vis, let's say, pre-1994?
They have declined a lot, and that trend is growing. In fact, it has accelerated quite rapidly, right? When, for instance, you look at, 2013, that's the last report I have. In that year alone, we lost, 11% of union members. That is over 500,000 union members, right? In 1 year, right? 11 unions, I think 13 or so unions were deregistered. And that trend has been going on. Obviously, in that whole period, it wasn't always a straight line. The development of the union movement is obviously linked with, the rhythm of class struggles, the ebbs and the flows. And during that period, particularly when there's an urban struggle, the employers, the capitalists are on the offensive, and that has, an impact of disorganizing the workers, of weakening their unions. It's only that this period has been very prolonged, with an exception, particularly of outsourcing must fall moment against the background of the fees must fall in universities. And I think that's very important, because I think Patrick made a point, if I heard him very well, linking it with the organization of the working class in general, because it's not just the issue of organization of workers at the workplace. It's the fact that the organized working class as a social force, it has been in decline. You look at other theaters of the working class struggle, communities, the students, and all those things. And so, the students, I think, are a bit of an exception.
And what do you think is at the center of this decline? What are the sort of key causes of the blow over the last few years of the entire social sphere of working class capacity to self-organize? Well,
certainly, I think there are objective factors, and that is the offensive on the part of the capitalist class. And alongside the law that Comrade Patrick was explaining, right, it is predicated on a theory, the labor theory of value. Marx speaks about the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. What does he mean by that? Is that the employers, because of the pressure of competition and lowering the cost vis-a-vis the socially necessary amount of labor they spend in their own production, and they always want to cut on the cost of their own production to gain an advantage over their competitors. And that means there is a constant pressure with the force of the law to attack the wages, to casualize labor, to make workers to long for long hours, and to deny them the trade union rights in order to defend themselves and other things. So everything that we have seen by way of restructuring at a corporate level, the torrents of legislation coming out of, Parliament, the NETLEC, 2018, the right to strike, a number of anti-union legislation were passed. Now we're faced with another wave of attacks. All of that is expression of that logic, because ultimately the capitalist class, as Marx again put it, personifies, the logic of capital itself. The ANC relies on COSATU for support, but is forced to carry out attacks against the very rank and file base of COSATU, precisely because it is, as government, the executive management of the capitalist class, and expresses that. But the workers' movement must bear the responsibility ultimately. One, the pursuit of the alliance on the part of COSATU leadership, with a party that is not only, just a pro-capitalist party, but it is demonstrated again and again to be a very ruthless anti-working class party that is prepared to mow down the workers at Marigana, to show up the profit of the capitalist class in the mining industry, to brutalize the working class everywhere, to pass legislation that weaken the workers' movement. All of that have implications, but also not just for the workers in the workplaces, by the way. In the 80s, one of the understanding that underlined the workers' movement, the slogan of an injury, to one is an injury all, was not just in relation to solidarity of workers in workplaces. When you look at the minutes of the meetings of COSATU, like in Guruleni in the 80s, it is a war council of the working class. They are taking issues of public transport system, crisis of housing, of electricity. The VAL uprising that I think, and I know that you studied, if I'm not mistaken, from our discussions, I think it's more than a decade ago and so on. It was the unity of the civics, of the students, of the workers. Mm-hmm. And why did that unity weaken? And I'll come to the importance of that. Is that once the communities were the first one to be at the receiving end, and therefore at the call phase of the resistance against neoliberal attacks on the part of the ANC, the APFs, the anti-eviction movements, and all of that. And COSATU, out of loyalty to the ANC, abandoned communities. I know that they even chased APF out of the COSATU offices. Civic, the SANCO as well, prioritized alliance with the ANC, and that weakened the working class organization there. And the reason that is very important is that the working class organization fed off each other, right? Where you have strong organization, and I'll give an example with universities. One of the things is that, I coordinated the outsourcing must fall, and one of the things that I tell them is in relation to the fact that I got introduced at Wits University about the struggle of outsourced workers by yourself, by the way. You remember that. You used to be the one to organize that.
Let's hold it there, Sibei. I just want to take the headlines, and you'll continue that thought just after the headlines. It's 10:30 rather. I beg your pardon on Power Talk. I'm going to take the headlines with Nyaka Lotefu. Let's stay tuned.
Stay informed. Power Talk with Mbuyiseni and Ndlozi, 9 a.m. to midday on Power 98.7.
It's the 207th birthday of Karl Marx, and we are discussing the state of his ideas and the influence that they have in thinking about the future. We've got President of Giusa, Mametlwe Sibei, online, and Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Johannesburg. Sibei, you just to conclude your thought there, I'm sorry to cut you. We had to rush to the headlines.
Yeah. So the point I was making is that, for instance, the reason we had, many workers, right, that were previously outsourced at universities, cleaners, security guards, landscaping, they managed to grow the labor movement in those sectors in recent period. It was because of the role of the students, right? And the point I'm trying to underline is that once the working class organization weakened in one theater, that fit off, because when you look at the current composition of the labor movement, and where is this over 60% of workers that are not organized? Many of them are in small rural towns, rural areas, and the lack of strong civic community movements in those areas, which would have played an important role in helping in organization of these workers, is also the problem. So it's not just a fault in the power of the trade union movement, it's a fault in the organized power of the working class in general that is part of the problem. And I'm saying at the core of that, part of the problem of that is the politics of the official leadership of the workers' movement that is committed to the preservation of the alliance that means subordination of the workers and the working class in general to the logic of the capitalist system in crisis that is intensifying, doubling down on attacks on services, on attacks on the conditions of employment, on precarity of workers and all of that.
Prof, I don't know what's your assessment of the state of Marx's call for workers of the world to unite, focusing on South Africa. There hasn't been the global alliances at the levels we have seen in other decades on one hand. But Sibey decries what I think has become a very weakened liberation movement alliance. The ANC commands 40% at the moment of the electorate. It's in an alliance with liberal forces within the National Assembly and the executive, and COSATU itself couldn't help it out of the 2024 elections as it has over the years. We're looking at a general disorganization even at that level.
Yes, and I think we have a lesson just north of us about how that might, let's say, unfold. That is Zimbabwe. And I happen to work closely with Morgan Tsvangirai. I think your listeners would remember the Movement for Democratic Change. And although Morgan died of bone cancer in the mid-2010s, his role from the late 80s was profound, partly because of the reasons Sibey said. He was getting out and around into the full gamut of, let's say, exploited people in Zimbabwe. And he was, he's a strong proponent of radical land reform, and certainly was, acutely aware of gendered questions in the sort of workers' movement. But unfortunately, what Morgan ended up doing in the mid-1990s, as he got his momentum and as ZANU-PF, the sort of ANC equivalent, was falling apart, losing popular support, there was a democratic and liberal movement that he allied with. They advocated a new constitution. And there were white farmers, the Zimbabwean farmers who came from the stock from 1890 pioneer column that had stolen the land. And unfortunately, the kinds of alliances that were made against the nationalist decay, that it was a neoliberal nationalist ZANU. They'd adopted World Bank structural adjustment programs, and they had really been beating up workers, just as the ANC under Jacob Zuma did so prolifically, and of course Cyril Ramaphosa with his role in Marikana, and what we've just seen in Stilfontein with the mine workers literally being starved to death. And that same process was occurring. And unfortunately, as we've heard from Sibey, this problem of leadership that turns more into a class snuggle, and they snuggled in the case of the Movement for Democratic Change with white farmers, and that gave them a very serious credibility problem and allowed a sort of resurgent nationalism. And I think that might be one of the lessons. The nationalist liberatory project, as it gets corrupted, as class formation begins, that Frantz Fanon was most eloquent about the way that a new elite comes up because there aren't many opportunities outside the state to accumulate. So they do it through corruption and vile kind of activities in and around the state.
Let me take you up on nationalism, Prof. Isn't nationalism, by Marx's predictions, supposed to have weighed down or completely ossified, not ossified, all that is solid melts into air. Yet, it is at the center of Chinese capitalist success because it's a capitalism with Chinese characteristics. It is now, when we look at Europe as well as America, at the center of the sort of imperialist movement recovery, so to speak. Donald Trump has came back to stage over and over again on the basis of, American nationalism. Brexit,
Yes, and
British nationalism. So nationalism, in a sense, still plays a fundamental role in organizing capital and nations across the world. And yet, with capitalism developing from a Marxist point of view, patriarchy, nationalism, and other opium-based ideologies should have been eliminated. Was Marx wrong?
Yeah, I think he was. I mean, the opium of the masses, let's call it, as you were hinting at, the sort of false consciousness I could see in a group of people, because I did my university studies in the US, and that white working class that displaces its aggravations, its exploitation, and the deindustrialization of places where I used to live in Baltimore and Philadelphia. And then figures that the solution to that would be Trumpism, whereas in fact Donald Trump and his billionaire mates, including our own Johannesburg high-schooled Elon Musk, have been devastating to workers and will be even more. So there's certainly you look at Reform Party last week doing so well in the UK polls with Nigel Farage attracting again a sort of xenophobic side. That ideology, let's call it paleo-conservatism, it's far worse than the neoconservatism, right, of the Pentagon and State Department, or neoliberalism of the Treasury and the IMF and the World Bank. That paleo-conservatism of a new, let's say, nativist and isolationist and racist and Islamophobic and sexist and all of the sort of aspects of that cultural turn, including by some workers. That is, I think, what Marx didn't anticipate would be so widespread even at this stage in capitalism, in a sort of decaying Western capitalism, and also in places like Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. We have a tiny bit of it
and
here,
don't
too.
We? I mean, the rise of colored nationalism, the rise of other forms of ethnic nationalisms. But let me take two callers quickly. I've got Steve Lebelo in Deep Kloof. 1 minute, Steve. Welcome to Power Talk.
Okay, it was going to be two quick questions, but it will be one. Marxist theory as a theory of revolution may have been introduced, in the 1950s, 20s, and 50s in South Africa, and it may have served a different purpose. But in the aftermath, of the 1970s movement, Marxist theory as a theory of revolution was actually being weaponized against the black nationalism of the 1970s. Would Professor Richard Bond agree with that?
Okay. Steve Lebelo there in Deep Kloof asking about black consciousness. Pumlani in Ruo Deport. 1 minute.
Awesome. Leaders, I'm not sure if you've heard of the Venus Project. The Venus Project is it's a form of organizing society. It's better than capitalism and communism. Please check it out. It started in the 1970s as social cyber engineering by a guy called Jacques Fresco. It's currently being led by Roseanne Meadows. Could you please...
Hey, Pumlani, your line is not very good, but have about a Venus Project and all of that. We'll see.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So there's a project called the Venus Project. It's there to uplift humanity, all humanity, regardless of country. So it's a non-profit organization. The reason why I'm telling you about this is because it's a way of organizing society. It's far more better than capitalism and communism. Last point, communism has been tried and tested. It killed a lot of people. So hunger, man-made famine, deportations, forced labor, it comes with a lot of contradictions itself. Forget contradictions of capitalism. Communism itself, it comes with its own, and I still said that you are discussing it. You are discussing Karl Marx's ideas without its effects because they've been tried and tested. We saw what happened. I was born in 1982. I was not really there, but I read up. I saw what it did to humanity. Thank you.
Pumlani in Ruodiport. There is a contradiction in the studio here about constantly paying bills. Let me pay my bills and then we can come back for the concluding remarks of our guests. This is Power Talk with me, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. Stay tuned.
Where your voice is heard and opinion matters.
It's the 207th birthday of one of the most influential 19th century thinkers, and very influential as well to the self-organizing of many trade unions in many, many decades across the last 100 years here in South Africa. It's none other than Karl Marx. Prof, I'm going to start with you. Some of your reactions to what the callers had to say.
Yes, I think the question of race and class is vital in this country because we've had a number of Marxists who, I think we could go back to Rosa Luxemburg, 1913, and she was drawing on all sorts of contemporary accounts she never visited. She was a great Polish Marxist who was in Berlin and founded the German Communist Party and then was assassinated. And then we had Harold Walpe. And between those two, they did something that added to Marx, which was add not just in Das Kapital, the relations within capitalism, but between capitalism and the non-capitalist, and particularly that's the racial factor and gendered super exploitation. You know, when migrant workers are pushed from their local kraals and there's a hut tax and they're forced to work in the mines. Well, they're particularly cheap, the cheap labor thesis of Harold Walpe, because women are doing the social reproduction, making sure the kids are raised, looking after sick or injured workers, looking after older workers. That super subsidy, of course, all parts of capitalism rely on that patriarchy to have women do unpaid work. But that was something I think we built on from Marx using South Africa and, of course, race. And the big question, if we were sitting here 50 years ago, Mbuyiseni, in our seminars at WITS or some of these sites where you could talk Marxism then, you'd be asking, does capitalism need apartheid? And in other words, if you need to get rid of the apartheid system, and that's what Steve Biko was asking. He was doing it in Durban, and it's at the University of Natal Black section, the medical school, and he brought it through the politics of Zappo, and that became such a great question. I always recommend on that Ben Magubani's work. And so in our social theory class, this great old Communist Party theorist, Ben Magubani, had a sophistication far beyond Luxemburg and Harold Walpe, because he saw this capitalist requirement for racism as evolving. So he wasn't surprised that apartheid could be dismantled, the scaffolding moved away. But he looked at racism as slavery from the Portuguese, the first foreign direct investment in South Africa from the days of Diaz and Vasco da Gama. And then the next big FDI was the Dutch East India Company, Van Riebeck. That was a different kind of racism, of extermination of the locals that they wanted to get the land from in Table Mountain. And then the third big wave of FDI, the diamond miners and the London capitalists Cecil Rhodes organized. They wanted workers not for slaves, not for extermination, but for brutal super exploitation as migrant workers. And that was a new kind of race and class relations. And then that evolved with Anglo-American taking the momentum here in Johannesburg into the sort of race class that became apartheid. Those relations that kept workers so cheap that South African mining capital was the most lucrative. And I think each time the labor theory of value, the ideas of Marx need that adjustment, not because there's a racial capitalism that is static, but because it's dynamic. And today's racism that feeds certain kinds of capitalists and their profits is a very different kind, obviously, over time. I think that's the beauty of Marxist theory, is that it must adapt and can adapt to not just its own version of a law of motion of capitalism that leads to exploitation and capitalist crisis, but that it also sees the environmental, the gender, the race, and so many other features. And I hope your readers your listeners would read the Communist Manifesto, 1848, just to give a sense of that fluidity and that, let's say, flexibility and the beauty of Marx and Engels' writing at that point. But then there are probably lots of Marxist groups. I don't follow them all. I'm sure Sabe will give you some suggestions. But certainly if you're in a trade union or environmentalist, you're a consumer and community movement person, you're interested in healthcare, well, you're going to run up against capitalism. Karl Marx can be a useful guide for you.
Sibey, the nationalist project that you spoke and characterized as having sort of been at the center of the destruction of self-organizing capabilities on the part of the working class as a whole, is at its weakest following the 2024 electoral outcomes. It had to go into an alliance with openly liberal forces to constitute government. the prospects at that level, at least, vis-a-vis the rest of, civics and students and all of that, the prospects of the working class to reorganize itself in the way that COSATU ANC alliance had achieved for almost 30 years in this country. What's your assessment?
Well, a Russian revolutionary, Leon Trotsky, makes an important point that under bourgeois democracy, the bourgeois itself does not have a choice of who comes into power. The working class makes majority of the electorate. The power of the bourgeois class and the capital as such, right, lies and consists in the fact that once a party is elected into power and does not break the monopoly of the capitalist class over the ownership, the private ownership of the means of production, the mines, the factories, the banks, farms, the land, all of that, right, is that once they do not break with that, they have no choice but to follow the dictates of the capitalist class, who utilizes their levers of economic power, and particularly, right, they finance capital in order to dictate and impose what direction that government actually take on all the most important questions. And I think the 2024 elections is an expression of that, because the choice of an alliance with the DA, with the parties that are of the parties of independent, racist, independent, xenophobes, and all of sorts of reactionary parties was rigged in the interest of monopoly capital in order to double down on the attacks on the working class, to accelerate privatization of ESCOM, now of Transnet, a number of other public services, post office and so on that we mentioned, as well as intensify exploitation through an increased precarity of employment, which now want to generalize by making it easy to dismiss all workers, both casual and, of course, those that are supposed to be secure. That is what this is about, right? To break the bottlenecks of what they consider to be the real reason behind the stagnation of the economy in the past 15 years. I mean, since the Great Recession of 2008-2009, there hasn't been really a growth in any meaningful way. You either have a recession or a very weak growth. I mean, this year, the highest ambition is that we'll have a 1% growth, which is actually a decline of GDP per capita because, last year, I think population grew by 1.07, a year before 1.3%, and the economy has grown by less than that. That means a real decline. And that's all the more reason that Marx becomes absolutely important. Because as a unionist, particularly in the period of the crisis, if you don't understand that the capitalist class cannot manage capitalism in the period of an organic and a deepening organic crisis, such as the one that we are passing through, by means of brutal austerity on the working class, you can't be an effective unionist. The capitalists, all these attacks that I speak about, they flow from the logic of the system in crisis, because for the capitalist class, the crisis in the economy consists first and foremost in the crisis of profitability. Now, if you're a unionist and you're not equipped and armed with perspectives for socialist alternatives, and can only imagine that society can only be managed and operated on the basis of profit-driven economy, that logically you have got to say, well, employers must then be able to carry out retrenchments, a cut on the conditions of the workers, because many workers, and I talk to them in many occasions, they think unionists sell out because they've been bribed. I say lots of the treachery happens at the ideological level. So a unionist agreed to retrenchment of 1,000 workers because he wants to save 9,000 workers that are going to remain in that particular mine. They agreed to cut in wages because they want to save jobs if they can. They agreed to many attacks because there's always a worse scenario. Why? They cannot imagine the way that the workplaces, the industry, the economy, and society can be organized on any other basis than that. And I think that for us is very important. The idea that socialism has failed is a misnomer. Soviet Union was never a socialist state. It was a transitional state that actually experienced counter-revolution that the working class could not overcome. But even in that period, let's look at what Soviet Union achieved on the basis of the public ownership of the economy, minerals, and the land in that country. They emerged from being the most backward feudal state in Europe to the second most industrialized as well as military power, second only to the US, that achieved the same level of development on the basis of enslavement of tens of millions of black people, but also by colonizing vast parts of the world, not so much in a classical colonial, but you go the Monroe Doctrine that gave them monopoly over exploitation of Latin America, but also they are the empire, as you know, they are plundering and pillaging the rest of the world today.
Ifakele. Ndlozi Bay, president of KIUSA, thanks very deeply for that reflection. An hour is never enough. And Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Johannesburg trying to remember Karl Marx and the significance of his ideas in understanding our world today. Thank you both, gentlemen.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
We're going to take the news. It's 1100 hours with Nyakalot Fu. Stay tuned. When we come back, we're talking human trafficking.